Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Korach, beginning in the book of Numbers, chapter 16. Korach, for whom our portion is named, was a great man who possessed a great intellect, a Levite who was numbered among those whose divinely appointed task was transporting the Ark of the Covenant. But our portion is all about the rebellion he fomented, a revolt that seemed to start out as a movement for equality, a protest against the status of Moshe and Aaron. But soon it became clear that Korach's mutiny was against God himself. Korach's argument was different than the sins of this generation that preceded it. The causes of all the previous conflicts had been a lack of bread and water, a craving for meat, the burden of the traveling, fear, or lack of confidence. In those cases, the rebellion always had begun in the lower ranks of the people and slowly swept up everyone. But Korach came from Moshe's own family of Levi, and up until now, the Levites had never been involved in these rebellious sins. In fact, way back at the incident of the golden calf, Korach was among those who responded to Moshe's call of, "Whoever is for Hashem, come to me," together with his brethren, the Levites. And Korach's claims against Moshe were much more far-reaching and had graver implications than any argument or rebellion until now. His controversy was not over any practical issue, but rather over the transmission of and over the nature of Torah itself. Korach claimed that Moshe is adding to Torah on his own. This was no simple personal issue that Korach had with Moshe. It was about the way in which Hashem chose to reveal himself and speak with the people. Moshe has consistently made it clear that he's nothing but a vessel. This rebellion morphed from simple jealousy of Moshe into something far worse, Korach's total denial of God. Korach's problem is actually with Hashem himself, and ultimately he denied that God created the world. And, painting himself into a corner, he denied that there even is a God. So it all starts out with Korach motivated by jealousy and the desire for honor. But he was a master manipulator, and in order to broaden his power base and gain support, he claimed to be speaking on behalf of all the people. So he succeeded in inciting 250 of the most respectable of the nation's leaders to join his revolt. His own arrogance poisoned him to the extent that he turned this insurgence into an attack on unbelief in God altogether. That became his true goal, as he sought, through his attack on Moshe, to unravel and deconstruct the foundation of the Torah which Israel received at Mount Sinai. Korach's massive ego drove him to wage a direct rebellion against Hashem. When a person's ego is in check, he can find peace and dwell in peace with other people. There's room for everybody. But when a person is as ego-driven as Korach was, there's no room for anyone else, not for Moshe and not for Hashem, to both of whom Korach was really saying, "This is my world, you're in my way." Regarding an arrogant person, our sages teach that whoever walks with a haughty bearing, it's as if he's pushing against the feet of the divine presence. Like he's saying to God, "You're crowding me, there's no room for both of us." This is Korach exactly. Now everyone knows who Moshe is. How could anyone ever forget that he was willing to give up his life for his people, as he entreated God in the aftermath of the golden calf episode in Exodus 32? "If you're not willing to forgive their sins, erase my name from your book." He never put himself above anyone. He saw himself as nothing but a vessel to bring them Hashem's word. The I never mattered to Moshe, because it was never about him. And as far as he was concerned, it could very well be someone else. He was truly without ego, as Hashem testified. Moshe was exceedingly humble, more than any person on the face of the earth. Numbers chapter 12. About who else did God ever say such a thing? No one. And Aaron, who lived to bring about peace in this world, was Hashem's choice, and Korach was not able to get over that. So it was belief in and connection to Hashem altogether that Korach was really driven to undermine. During the incidents of the prophecy of Eldad and Medad, back in the Torah portion of Bahalotcha, Moshe said to Yoshua, "If only the whole nation of God were prophets, that Hashem should place his spirit upon them," back in Numbers chapter 11. But now Korach is using Moshe's own words against him, saying, "The entire congregation is holy, and Hashem is in their midst. So why do you raise yourselves up against the congregation of Hashem?" So open up your heart in the deepest way. Okay, so Korach says to Moshe, "Why do you raise yourselves up against the congregation of Hashem?" But the claim is absurd. Moshe raised himself up above others? The man was totally selfless, and nothing could be further from the truth. But in order for a lie to circulate and take hold, and certainly in order to sell one this big, and to succeed in getting other people on board, we would think that it has to be based on some kernel of truth. But Korach's claim makes no sense. How could he have said this? If this was a mistake, or if at least if it began in error, how could he have made this mistake to think about Moshe, about whom God himself calls the humblest of all men, that he raised himself above the congregation? Especially after they all see that the divine presence rests upon him. Torah already informed us back in Exodus chapter 34 that after Moshe descended again from Sinai, they could no longer even look upon his face. His skin actually glowed with godliness. Who could possibly think of such a man as being conceited? So this is very deep. Remember that the sin of the spies that we learned about in last week's portion of Shalach was the last straw in a series of rebellious sins of this generation. But it was the last straw, and it caused the entire nation to experience a sharp spiritual descent. A new reality was set. There was severe judgment on that generation, a harshness, a tension that remained in their relationship with God. God remained very displeased with this generation, and they were prevented from entering into the land by a divine decree that would remain in force until the entire generation passed. So now open up your heart to hear this truth. Hashem's displeasure resulted in this. During all of those years, the divine light that had shone on the children of Israel originally after receiving Torah at Sinai and when they had just begun their trek, during all of the years of Hashem's wrath, that divine light was concealed. The sin of the spies changed that dynamic of their relationship, changed everything. The collective spiritual level of the people plummeted. However, open up your heart, Moshe's level was not affected. His relationship with God, the high level that he attained, was unchanged. So during these years, there was like a huge gap, a chasm between Moshe and the people. He was like out of their league. They could not relate to him. And honestly, ultimately, they really had no clue who he really was. His holiness was so beyond their grasp. They simply had no idea who the man really was. Their spiritual vision was so impaired that they had no knowledge of his spiritual level. It was so far beyond their understanding. So we go even deeper and keep your heart open wide. Everybody knows at the end of last week's Torah portion of Shalach, we received the mitzvah, the commandment of tzitzit, the fringes that God instructed should be placed at the corner of a Jewish man's garment. At the end of chapter 15, we read in these verses, "And Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them that they shall make for themselves fringes on the corners of their garments throughout their generations. And they shall affix a thread of sky blue, talit, on the fringe of each corner. This shall be fringes for you, and when you see it, you will remember all of the commandments of Hashem to perform them, and you shall not wander after your hearts and after your eyes, after which you are going astray, so that you shall remember and perform all my commandments, and you shall be holy to your God." So, Hashem's commandment requires that on a garment, let's say the garment is white, and in the tzitzit, the fringes, there should be one thread, one string of talit, the sky blue color. Now, exactly how the tzitzit should be made, consisting of so and so many knots and strings, and why the one thread of sky blue, what the significance is, how it's made, all that is for another time. I don't want to digress now, but our sages give over a very deep teaching that Korach took his rebellious argument with Moshe to a very public level. And in the context of the argument, Korach took 250 of the leaders of Israel, important men that he had won over to his side, and he dressed them all in talitot, plural for talit, what's known today as the large prayer shawl that we wrap ourselves in for prayer. He dressed them each in a talit that was completely made of talit-colored wool, a completely blue garment. So he set this up, this psychodrama, and confronted Moshe, and in mockery, he posed this question. He said, "Tell me, what is the law of Torah? If a talit is completely blue, should it not be exempt from the blue string of tzitzit altogether? If one string of blue fulfills the obligation of talit for an entire talit, then a talit made entirely of blue should be exempt from, should not require one string of blue." Now, whether or not this actually happened, or the sage is simply employing this powerful scene as a midrashic device, a metaphor to give over to us a deep truth, is irrelevant. Midrash is not to be understood literally. What the scene conveys, what Korach meant was, Moshe is the one string, and the talit is the whole nation. And since the whole nation is holy, like an entirely blue garment, why do you raise yourself above everyone else? But this teaching is so, so deep. And here, once again, you have to open up your heart and listen. Because really, the deep truth, according to the secret, is that the garment of the talit itself possesses a higher level of holiness than the threads of the tzitzit. But the talit's holiness is beyond our comprehension, and therefore, it is the fringes that we can relate to, that we can grasp, and which we regard as holy, and not the garment. As the holy Arizal teaches, this again is the principle that we spoke about last week in our study of Parashat Shalach. The holier something is, the more concealed it is from view. But what's more, open up your heart, in the deepest way ever, the greater the light, the more people consider it as mundane. It just goes above our heads. The greater the light, the more people look upon it as ordinary, mundane, because we have no grasp of it. But rather than realize that it's our problem, our smallness, that we have no ability to understand something so great, rather than own up to it, it's human nature. It's easier for a person to say, oh, that's not important. There's nothing there to see, because I don't see anything. Therefore, there must be nothing to see. It can't be my problem. This is a huge lesson. So when this massive gap between Moshe and the people was created, and the children of Israel did not perceive his holiness due to their spiritual diminishment, they could not understand who he was. And thus they were able to reduce him in their minds so much that they could not even consider him as, behaving towards them with haughtiness. And this is the secret of how Korach was able to get away with this, to say with impunity, why do you raise yourselves above the congregation of Hashem? The metaphor of the talit illustrates the mistake that Korach made in regard to Moshe. He claimed, why should a totally blue talit require one string of blue? But the light of the talit itself is so high that it's incomprehensible. But one string of blue serves as a conduit, a connector that limits and channels the light into a manageable amount that can be understood and received according to the level of the recipient. So if the light of an ordinary talit is so great that it cannot be understood, what would be gained if the entire talit was dyed with the talit blue color? Whatever is a greater source of light, the less it can be comprehended. This was Korach's mistake regarding Moshe. He did not understand that the fact that they could not get Moshe because of his great level, just as Korach's inability to perceive the holiness of the talit was not because of its lacking, but on account of its great light. So what would be accomplished if the garment was all blue? This is a true life lesson that each of us needs to know for living in Hashem's world. You'll always find it. Whatever is holier is less understood and concealed. And Korach chose to believe that the problem was on Moshe's end. According to his ego-driven, myopic vision, Moshe's light was darkness. This is the deepest of the deep, and if I can ask you to open up your hearts one more time. This secret of our sages is known as the concept of the darkness of holiness. It's called darkness because it's hidden from our view. This type of darkness is the opposite of the simple meaning of darkness, which is just the absence of light. The darkness of holiness is the light of a level of holiness so high, so great, that it's beyond comprehension. This is the secret of the verse 12 in Psalms chapter 18. He made darkness his concealment, around him his shelter. This verse is referring to this concept of the darkness of holiness, which is beyond understanding. And the deepest understanding of all, of course, is that it requires humility to accept the truth of a light which is higher than understanding. And thus Korach, who denied Moshe and Hashem, who would not see and not acknowledge that something could be beyond his understanding, who could not comprehend the darkness of holiness, whose limited vision and small-mindedness instead accused Moshe of elevating himself. This is exactly why Korach was punished in such an unprecedented manner, to descend alive into the earth, into the pit, a place of darkness, in Hashem's perfect system of justice, known as measure for measure. His measure, Korach's measure of his own creation, was darkness itself. Moshe addressed the entire congregation, including those who were in doubt, but who were drawn by the seduction of Korach. And he said, through this shall you know that Hashem has sent me to perform all these acts, that it was not from my heart. If Hashem will create a phenomena, and the earth opens up its mouth and swallows them and all that is theirs, and they will descend alive to the pit, Then you will know that these men have provoked Hashem. Korach and his people meet Moshe's challenge. When the moment of the test came, Moshe tells Aaron Hashem's instructions that he also should bring his fire pan with incense like the other 250 men in order to show that it should be revealed to all who Hashem chooses. And Moshe warns them all that they're rebelling against Hashem, and therefore Korach and his men will go down alive and the others will die. And it was when he finished speaking all of these things that the ground split under them, and fire came forth from Hashem and consumed the 250 men who offered the incense. But Korach was swallowed up alive, as the verse tells us. And according to our sages, he lives on down there, unsettled and unresolved, suspended. So here too, is this a metaphor or literal? It matters not. It's all about what this concept teaches us, what it means that he remains perpetually stationary in the lowest possible place. The solid ground of the earth beneath our feet is our stability. We're on solid ground, we like to say, beyond any doubt. But fueled by his ego, Korach felt that Hashem cramped his style, and thus he even denied that Hashem created the world. He opened up for himself a portal to instability. The earth opened up its mouth, but Korach was literally swallowed up by his own arrogance because of a light so bright that he saw it as darkness. May Hashem open up our eyes to the light. Shalom, dear friends. Thank you so much for your support. We appreciate it so very much. It's only your support that enables Jerusalem Lights to continue its outreach of Torah for everyone.